Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending where you're joining us from. And a very warm welcome to the official virtual launch of our new report from the inside out, Peacebuilding and Conflict Resolution in a Changing World Order. My name is Julia Strasheim. I'm the Deputy Managing Director of the Helmut-Schmidt Foundation, or BKHS in Hamburg, Germany. And last year, we at BKHS set up a global expert group on conflict resolution and peace building, together with our dear colleagues and dear friends at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. And this group is a network of 13 distinguished representatives from academia, from politics, and from civil society, who all come from conflict-affected and post-conflict countries and who work on peace building and conflict resolution in their regions. And some of them are joining us today. The group met to discuss several questions. They met to discuss the Ukraine war's impact on other conflict-affected societies around the world over the past 2 years. They met to discuss past pitfalls of international peace building that are at risk of being repeated. I think we should see the next slide now. And they met to discuss what the future of peace building could look like in a changing world order and amid the massive global challenges in the area of peace and security that we are witnessing these days. And their discussions and their contributions, together with further interviews that we conducted with other experts from academia, from think tanks, from government, from NGOs, from diplomacy, that's what's all providing the substance of the report that we're really excited to launch today. But why this report and why this report now? From our perspective, we think that the report couldn't really come at a more crucial time. We're convening today just prior to the 2nd anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but not only looking at Ukraine, also looking at Hamas's attack on Israel and on the current war in Gaza, or at escalating violence that we see in places such as Sudan, such as Yemen, such as Myanmar. This all shows us that war is on the rise globally. And ACLED, the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, recently actually estimated that 1 in 6 people in the world have been exposed to conflict so far in 2024. Of course, war is not only increasing, it is also becoming more complex. It's increasingly internationalized, with regional actors supporting the warring parties. We also see that many countries are now hosting several and only sometimes overlapping conflicts that differ in their goals and that are also exposing communities to various forms of violence. As war is on the rise, building peace has seemingly become ever more difficult. The last large-scale UN peace operation was set up in 2014, and many internationally brokered peace processes have broken down in the past decade. We know that this is due to many things, due to growing geopolitical conflict between the major powers, also because countries that traditionally invest very heavily in peace building, including Germany, are confronted with changing security priorities or are confronted with their own domestic crises, including the rise of right-wing extremism. Of course, also the return to power of the Taliban in Afghanistan was also a very clear sign that the era in which we thought that we could build peace using Western templates seems to be over. But, and this lets me turn to some of the insights from our report, building peace has also become harder because of the Russian war on Ukraine's very diverse impact on conflict-affected countries around the globe, and of course, wider and corresponding geopolitical developments. And I'm happy to give you now just a short glimpse at some of our report's findings. We do know that the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine has been felt around the globe over the past 2 years, but the challenges that were confronted by conflict-affected countries in particular have actually varied greatly. For some of these countries, of course, the invasion has felt very distant, has felt very remote in the face of other and far more pressing crises, while for other countries, the fallout from Ukraine has had a much more severe impact. But what we show in the report is that not all of these effects show up in European political and public discourse, and not all of these effects are understood in European capitals in all of their complexity. And if we go to the next slide now, we see that one of the first issues that our group stressed in this regard relates to blind spots in European debates. So debates that have focused very much on the Ukraine war's impact on peace and security, on EU peace and security. And to give you a very concrete example for such a blind spot, the experts that we talked to emphasized that the move by European governments to become more independent of Russian oil and Russian gas by placing European energy security on a broader footing, that this move in 2022 was often framed as a way forward for energy security and a way forward for climate sustainability. And it was also often said that this move increases windfalls for other commodity exporters in the world, for instance, because other countries benefit from the high prices and the high demand in the EU. But we also saw that in regions such as Latin America, that this development was also very closely linked to questions of peace and security. And it was particularly so among the already vulnerable and already marginalized communities and the people who live close to extraction sites. For instance, because the construction of dams for hydroelectric power can result in floodings or cause the forced displacement of communities. And this all raised the questions of what clean energy actually means and what it does for whom. So the experts stressed that European policymakers need to become more aware of the various global impacts their policies have, for instance, by strengthening capacities for analysis, for monitoring, and for evaluation. A second issue the group stressed was that building peace has also become harder because the Russian war in Ukraine has over the past 2 years contributed to intensifying already existing crises in many conflict-affected countries. And this refers to issues such as the prevalence of local violence, the consequences of structural inequalities, of economic inequalities, of global inequalities, the climate crisis, or the post-pandemic recovery. And so in many contexts, Russia's attack on Ukraine was not perceived as a Zeitenwende, to use the German term, a historic turning point, but more as an amplifier or a multiplier or accelerator of existing crises. And this underlines a really crucial aspect. Because armed conflict increasingly takes place in countries that are affected by many crises that happen simultaneously and that are also interlinked, some of the actions that were taken to ease some of the most acute global consequences of the Ukraine war, thinking, for instance, of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, that these actions were really important, but they were also really modest steps to address the structural drivers of crises such as food insecurity. And therefore, from a German perspective, of course, this is also something that was stressed by the German Bundestag Study Commission on Afghanistan this week that speaks in this regard of departmental egotism. The experts we talked to, again, ever more underlined the very crucial point that so many others have made before us, namely that in order to find durable solutions to increasingly interconnected crises, policymakers need to further break down silos between policy fields and need to mobilize resources in a much more integrated manner than thus far, which means also becoming better at addressing structural causes of conflict and acute drivers of conflict at once, for instance, by providing for spending patterns that can follow both short and long-term objectives. And now coming to my final point before handing things over to my colleagues, a third reason that was stressed with regard to why the global fallout from Ukraine has made peace building more difficult in many other parts of the world was also that the immense public and political focus on Ukraine in European capitals very quickly crowded out the already fading attention to other crises. And Syria or Afghanistan were most cited as an example for this dynamic. And this, in the view of the people that we talked to, has worsened already existing donor fatigue. It has worsened already existing funding gaps. And those we talked to very much fear that an already declining and an already half-hearted engagement will become even more half-hearted and will even more lack knowledge, lack financial resources, and lack political will for long-term commitment. And this, of course, has an effect on people living in conflict zones, but it also has a political effect. Because of course, policymakers must prioritize and cannot act everywhere at all times. And half-hearted engagement in many different places at once neither solves these conflicts, nor does it help European governments achieve any foreign policy goals. But not engaging does come with its own costs, and very common perceptions in many conflict-affected countries that they are the ones paying for legitimate European support to Ukraine. This has fueled debates about Europe's lack of reliability as a partner. We know, gathered here today, that peace building is a generational project that requires predictable funding, sustained funding that is well adapted to societal needs. And from this view, of course, cutting peace building, humanitarian and development budgets, looking, for instance, at the German federal budget this year, but also at other European countries, of course, runs counter to rising global needs in this area. Now that I had the role of outlining the many challenges and the many problems, let's talk solutions. What could peace building look like in a changing global order? Peace building that does not repeat pitfalls of the past. And for this, I'm really excited to hand over to Tina Blohm. Tina is an advisor on peace and security at the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation and my dear partner in crime in this in implementing this project. And Tina will moderate a discussion between 4 members of our global expert group before my BKHS colleague Kirsten comes in to moderate the Q&A. And it's really terrific to have with us today, joining in from, I think, different time zones, Happymon Jacob, who's an associate professor of diplomacy and disarmament at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, India, Lidet Tadesse Shiferaw, who's an associate director of the Peaceful Societies and Accountable Governance Cluster at the European Center for Development Policy Management in Maastricht and Brussels. Velma Šarić, the founder and president of the Post-Conflict Research Center in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Viviana García Pinzón from Colombia, who's a senior researcher at the Arnold Bergstraesser Institute in Freiburg. It's so great to have all of you with us today. And with that, I'm handing things over to you, Tina.
Thank you so much, Julia. And yes, also a warm welcome from my side here from Berlin to our expert group members who joined us, but also to all of you, our audience, listening to the conversation and joining the conversation in a second. I'd like to start off to my panelists with a short, what I call a spotlight question. And I would like you to give an answer of about, I would say, 1 sentence maximum, right? You can also just say a word or a phrase. So in your opinion, what is currently the most important trend or development in peace building and conflict resolution? And I would like to start off with the first short sentence with Velma.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation. Regards from Sarajevo, Bosnia. I mean, I will say one word globally. I would say prevention. And if I'm talking about my region and my country, I would say stability.
Lovely, great. And yes, you can break that down into a global dynamic and into one dynamic that is specifically looking at the region or the context that you're looking at. And I continue with Viviana.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Thank you for the invitation. So regarding the trends, globally, I would say that peace building and conflict resolution is in a crucial moment with the exacerbation of unresolved issues and contradictions that are limiting the capacity to address complex and interrelated crises. And regarding the region, Latin America, I think we are witnessing the strengthening of authoritarian forms of conflict resolution amid the increasing levels of violence and insecurity, and also democratic backsliding.
Thank you so much. That was a very long and interesting sentence. Thank you so much, Viviana. And I go on and move over to Happymon.
Thank you, Tina. I think I stick to 1 sentence. I would say that regional stakeholdership in peace building is perhaps the trend and should continue to be the trend. Thank you.
Many thanks, Happymon. And last but not least, Lidet.
Yeah, I would say globally, it's that conflict resolution is held hostage by geopolitics. And regionally, I would say bad governance and neglect the consequences of it has come home to roost.
Great, thank you so much. I think those answers have already shown us what a wide scope of issues we are dealing with and what different angles we can take towards the subjects and towards a solution that we're trying to find for the future. I'm now going to ask you, each of you, 1 or 2 questions. And I would like to start with Viviana. You just said you look in your research at Latin America and with a particular focus on Colombia and El Salvador. And you just said as the challenge that you see in the future, the trend that you see in the future, the strengthening of authoritarian forms of conflict resolution, that is an issue. If you should, or if you can outline how to address that trend or that worrisome trend, what should be done to address it and how can it be changed? Viviana, over to you.
Thank you for the question, Tina. Yes, well, I think first of all is to consider that it's necessary to be aware of the differences in the problems in the region, because usually we talk about Latin America, but it's a very heterogeneous and there is a variety of problems and conditions. However, I would like to mention 3 aspects to address this trend that I just described. First, the need to address the role of the state, often in enabling the action of illegal armed actors and the role of the state itself in producing violence. I think something that is quite visible in the case of Latin America is these linkages between state actors and organized crime groups at different levels, and also how corruption remains as a central issue. There has been different efforts to address corruption, for instance, but this has been resisted, as we saw in the case of Guatemala with the UN-backed International Commission Against Impunity. However, I think it's important to insist on improving state capacities in terms of transparency, prosecution, accountability, instead of just focusing on the strengthening of the coercive capacity of the state. So I think this is important to alter this trend. And another aspect, I think, is putting more emphasis in protecting and supporting grassroots and community-based initiatives in the region. Environmental and human rights defenders are among the most victimized groups in the region. And actually, they are the people that are trying to disrupt violence, not only physical violence, but also structural violence, marginalization. They know the context better, they know the character of the problems, and they are fighting, right, to change things. When we think of Latin America, perhaps the trend that I described is quite negative. However, I would like to mention also that there are so many grassroots initiatives and people that on a daily basis, they are trying to disrupt violence and peace, building peace. And I think they need all the efforts for this endeavor. And finally, if we consider more like the global context, I think it's necessary to shift away from failed drug policies and also a deep transformation of the drugs regime, right? That is characterized by prohibitionism. I think as long as this regime does not change, Latin America will continue facing violence that is like to a large extent related also to organized crime. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your view. I think that's what made our discussions that we had together also so special, that you have all these different views. We call the report from the inside out. So we are very keen to highlight the nuances that are there. But in the group, we also discussed a lot on double standards and the double standards that exist, that some wars get more attention than others, that some lives seem to have more importance than others. Viviana, from your perspective, what does double standards at the moment entail and what can be done to address double standards?
Okay, I think it's necessary to perhaps describe what we do mean when we say the double standards. I think this double standards has existed in the realm of peace and security from the inception of the institutional architecture and the conflict interventions and practices. We need to consider that all this system comes from the aftermath of the Second World War and was also established in the context of a still colonial order, and they manifest in multiple ways. For instance, we see them in the composition of multilateral institutions in which countries of the Global South do not hold equal participation and voice, although they are subject to the large share of interventions. They are also visible when looking at the differentiated attention and responses to war and violence in different parts of the world. We also see these double standards in the selective application of international law, in the way how some violence and war crimes are seen as justified in some cases, depending on who the perpetrator is, as well as in what cases holding accountability is effectively demanded. So I just want to mention that perhaps related to the report and the workshop that I was part of, we discussed these double standards with a focus on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we identified that they manifest in this massive attention and swift response from Europe to this war compared to the slow and poor reaction to war and violence in other geographies. And another instance that we identified was also this differential treatment of Ukrainian refugees vis-a-vis refugees coming from the African continent and the Middle East. I think that perhaps it's important to mention that the public sphere is currently witnessing another display of what can be perceived as double standards, with the terrorist attacks by Hamas on 7 October 2023, and the ensuing war waged by the Israeli government against Gaza. Because despite the evidence of war crimes committed by Israeli forces that even prompt the International Court of Justice to order provisional measures to prevent a potential genocide against Palestinians, Western countries, with the exception of some cases such as Spain or Ireland, have not only failed to call Israel out to follow these measures, but have also maintained their political and military support. And this has not gone unnoticed at the global scale, but also, this has been also part of debates in different scenarios in different countries. So I think that addressing double standards requires examining and taking issue with the power asymmetries lying at the basis of the peace-building system in a more concrete ways, and considering the current scenario, I think it's necessary to support all the efforts to demand for accountability for all international crimes. And I think that we are also witnessing how some countries from the global south are trying to demand and drive change. And I think to me, the question is to what extent forces from below can effectively bring about these changes, and also the role of the actors at the top. And I think something that is crucial when we think about double standards is that the legitimacy and the credibility of the whole peace-building system is at stake when we think or discuss about these topics.
Thank you so much. A richness of answers that you've given us, and I'm sure we're going to pick up some of them in the later discussion also. I'm going to turn to Happymon now. We've heard from Viviana about double standards, and in order to address them and to lessen them, there's also a lot of talk by politicians, by academics and so on new, more equal and mutually beneficial partnerships. From your perspective, what do these new partnerships, what do they need to entail? What do they need to look like, both on a multilateral level as well as on a bilateral level?
Thank you, Gina. Unfortunately, I'm going to repeat some of the excellent observations made by Viviana, because I think those are really at the heart of the issue that we are discussing. I think there is a feeling in the global south in general and in countries like India that there is a certain amount of double standard. I mean, look at the West's focus on the Ukraine war, or the perceived double standards when it comes to the humanitarian question in Gaza. I think these have unfortunately alienated a large number of countries in the global south. I think the pre-existing, this unhappiness also in some ways pre-exists before the Ukraine war or the Gaza question. And they somehow, again, as Viviana pointed out, some of these issues arise from the global institutions, the structure of the global institutions, which are monopolized by the US and the West. In fact, even during the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, there was very little help that the global south countries received from these institutions, which are, as I said, monopolized by the US and the West. Also on the question of debt restructuring, or the manner in which the developed nations have defaulted on the issue of climate financing, etc., have also been a major concern in the global south. And I'm afraid the change has to come from the top, right? I mean, because the power is at the top, it comes with certain responsibility. There must be more conversations about and genuine efforts for a more empowered UN General Assembly, for example, or a more inclusive UNSC or the World Bank or the IMF. I think for us the message is quite clear. We can either choose to repair the existing but weakening world order, or brace for a world order led by, say, perhaps China, whose contours are yet unknown. What kind of world order that is going to be. But I would sort of conclude by saying that in general, there is a strong feeling in the global south and in countries like India. And I'm paraphrasing the Indian foreign minister here, not that I'm a spokesperson of the Indian government, but that Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems and the world's problems are not Europe's problems. I think he sort of captured it quite well. The argument I think he's trying to convey is that Europe is only interested in the support of the global south during, say, issues like the Ukraine war, but also is not willing to support them in their time of need, like the COVID pandemic.
Thank you so much, Happymon. I'm going to ask a follow-up question again. We try to get to some solutions. So if you think of the future of how we try to create peace and security, and in particular the role of other nations in trying to support those endeavors, call it interventions, call it engagement or whatever, what should that look like? I think we are all sure that the age of, these large, also UN interventions, these large-scale military interventions over, but what will the future look like? Many say it's going to be much more fragmented, it's going to be very diverse, more short-term. But if you think a bit more from an idealist point of view, what would you say, what should international efforts to secure peace and security look like?
Thank you, Tina. On the question of reforming the global order, I argued that the initiative must come from the top. I think when it comes to peace building, the initiative cannot come from the top. It cannot be a top-down approach. The top-down approach to peace building, I am afraid, would not help anymore for a variety of reasons. One, I think the UN in many ways has lost the ability and the normative legitimacy in order to sort of create peace internationally. The West has unfortunately lost the moral plot. The world's sort of normative superpower, which is the European Union, is unwilling to even have a dialogue with Russia after having taught the rest of us that you must speak and have dialogue and engage in conversations with your adversaries even during the middle of wars and conflicts, as it were. So therefore, the going forward, we must have a more pragmatic and context-sensitive approach to peace building. And some of my recommendations, therefore, would be that use regional organizations for strengthening peace and security, such as the ASEAN, for example, or African Union in their sort of respective regions. And secondly, work with regional powers who are more conflict sensitive. For example, when it comes to Myanmar, ASEAN is perhaps the answer. India could also probably play a role. On the question of Afghanistan, perhaps, India is perhaps a good interlocutor. And thirdly, I think the use of more humbler approach and humbler language is important when it comes to peace building and conflict resolution in post-colonial settings. The age of helicopter peace building, sorry to put it that way, I think that is way past, that is over. I've been part of many track tours that we sort of house in Delhi, and my experience has been that we need more locally located, locally run, locally invested organizations running peace building work in sort of these regions. And my keywords, therefore, are local stakeholdership, local responsibility, and local approaches. With that, I hand it back to you, Tina.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we're going to get into what that locally means in particular, because it's not so easy sometimes to spell that out again. I'm going to turn, I think that's a nice bridge to Lidet. Your focus is you research extensively on African-European peace and security partnerships. And we've just heard from Happymon more of a focus on regional organizations. What would you say, the partnership that you've witnessed and analyzed over the past decade, how has that changed? And what should and can the future of that partnership look like? Lidet.
Yeah. In terms of what has changed, I would sort of resonate a lot of what Viviana and Happymon said resonates, in that one of the things that has changed in the EU-Africa partnership, or Europe-Africa partnership, is the credibility of Europe as a peace-building actor or as a peace actor has been hugely undermined because of some of the double standards that they mentioned, but also because Europe itself is sort of coming up with a different narrative of how it sees its role in the world. So from one that emphasizes soft power approaches, which to a large extent included support to peace building initiatives, Europe is now emerging, or at least ambitioning, to be a geopolitical actor itself. And this is something that essentially puts it in tension between, balancing on the one hand the values, be it democratic values and norms promotion, support to peace-building approaches, and on the other hand, geopolitics and ambitions to be a geopolitical actor, which comes with interest. And how do you prioritize and how do you balance the two? That's a big tension that Europe is faced with. So that's one of the things that has changed. The other thing that has changed is within the African continent, and because of some of the geopolitical changes that have happened in the world, there is conflicts are more and more internationalized. So before we used to talk about regional conflicts that go beyond borders. Now it's not just regional, but also global or internationalized, meaning some of the actors and the factors that play with and instigate conflicts, amplify them, have to do with external actors, be it from the east, be it from the west, or from the north and the south, because now we also have various other middle powers that have joined the game. And so the internationalizing of conflicts is another phenomena that the consequences of which has also been for Africa, has also posed difficulties for African regional mechanisms for conflict resolution, meaning mechanisms and institutions that were set up in order to resolve conflicts emerging in Africa of a national kind or a regional kind, are now challenged by the fact that there are international actors at play. So how do you even, this question of how do you even bring conflicting parties on the same table to negotiate, to mediate, who you have to bring to the table now has multiplied because you have actors from within the region and also without the region. So I would say this is also a time where we've seen the fragility or the limitations of African regional mechanisms and institutions in resolving conflicts.
Thank you so much. And if you would sort of zoom into one region that's debated quite a bit, the Sahel region, many of the changes that you've outlined are probably visible there already, right? But again, we're trying to also look at solutions. If you would look at the future of that engagement or the trends in the Sahel region, what would be some of the things you would recommend?
Yeah, I think, because I sit in Europe, I often see the analysis of Sahel the way it's analyzed in Europe. And oftentimes, the one thing that often is associated with the Sahel is the increasing role of Russia in the Sahel, or presence of Russia in the Sahel. But in reality, that could be one issue for Europe. But in reality, the main issue in the Sahel actually is the lack of socio-economic progress that the countries in the region have witnessed. And the root of insecurity in the Sahel very much is tied with grievances that have to do with neglect from the central governments in the Sahelian countries vis-a-vis the communities that are living in the region. And this neglect in terms of governing resource sharing. These are some of the issues that are very much at the root of insecurity in the Sahel. And I would say going forward, the priority should also be not to think about how to outsmart Russia or how to win the minds and hearts of Sahelians towards Europe, but it should be about how do we actually resolve some of these governance issues that we've witnessed in the Sahel? How do we actually ensure that people have safety and people have economic means in the Sahel? So essentially, this very much links to a discussion around development, and it very much links to a discussion around local peace-building approaches as well, because some of the conflict has to do with intercommunal resource sharing or other types of conflicts. So we very much have to go beyond the securitization of the Sahel towards also looking at the development and the socio-economic needs therein. And there, I think African regional organizations like the African Union, but African governments should also step up and sort of take more space and demonstrate more leadership to ensure there is a more sustainable way out for the Sahel. Because right now, much of the discussion has to do with, again, geopolitics or higher level political transition on when are you going to have the next election. And these things are important, but this is not a tick box exercise. It really needs to go beyond that, and it really needs to address the root causes of the issue, which is very economic and governance related.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to encourage you all on the question and answer. Please go ahead. If you have any thoughts as an audience, add your questions and we're going to pick them up in a few minutes. But before they do that, I would like to turn to Velma. Velma, you have also rich experiences in post-conflict peace building, particularly in Bosnia. And we would like to look a bit more into what can be learned from the Bosnian context for what is currently being discussed when it comes to reconstruction and recovery in Ukraine. We have a huge conference in Berlin in June coming up. Where do you see lessons to be learned? And where do you think comparability of the two contexts ends?
Thank you so much. Yes, I mean, unfortunately, Bosnia does have this rich experience of conflict and post-conflict reconstruction. And I mentioned that my first word was prevention. That is definitely, I would say, is extremely important part of the whole peace building studies, because prevention has been proved, at least through our work, when we over years ago started to work in the field of genocide and mass atrocity prevention, we have been considered quite strange. Like many civil society actors, even international community would ask us, why did you stuck with these boring old topics from 90s? You know, war is over. Now we need to move on. We need to move on toward like post-conflict reconstruction. Unfortunately, the Russian aggression against Ukraine really did remind us how peace is fragile. And if you don't resolve traumatic past, which is the case in Bosnia, and not just Bosnia, this is the whole region of Balkans, because the war in Bosnia was quite well connected regionally with Serbia, Croatia, and unfortunately, not solving and not fulfilling all these steps of transitional justice, all pillars. We never, for example, deal with reparation. We still are missing, searching for missing people here. More than 100,000 people have been killed. More than 2 million people became refugees. According to the UN data, between 20 and 50,000 women went through rape and sexual violence. So all these lessons and all these unfortunately horrific crimes did also give us some expertise, which we can share now and help our colleagues in Ukraine. I need to mention that there are some like good developments, especially in the field of missing people. The International Commission of Missing People, who was established in Bosnia, and this method of DNA was piloted through Srebrenica genocide, is now being replicated in Ukraine. And many other lessons and many other things can be learned, especially in the field also of documenting sexual violence and crime, because we do know that unfortunately many women in Ukraine went through similar crimes, through rape and sexual violence, and we do have this legacy. So there is a lot of parallels. If we take a look, Kiev, it reminds us a lot on the siege of Sarajevo. If we take a look, crimes being committed like through the country of Ukraine, it does remind us a lot on, you know, crimes being committed during the Srebrenica genocide. So why I'm mentioning this, in the core of our work should be, I completely agree, grassroots and local ownership, definitely. It should be definitely a mix with prevention. What I want to mention in the case of Bosnia, at least we do have one good experience working in the field of prevention with the United Nations Office of special advisor for genocide prevention and mass atrocity. In the last 12 years, we have been working extensively on educating and networking between civil society and learning about genocide prevention and mass atrocities. I do believe that, you know, a special focus should be put in this area, and I do believe in power of networking. So our work in this moment regarding prevention is quite regional. We work with colleagues from, you know, former Yugoslavia, and we do try to build a joint action plan and agenda, how we will look in the past and how we will definitely continue to work in the field of prevention.
So do you think we are capable of learning? If I listen to you, what's been happening, the networking and so on, do you see improvements in the way that we learn from past events and past mistakes?
I mean, I'm trying to, you know, sound more positive, because if I start to speak about, you know, the current problems and issues we have in Bosnia and the region, I mentioned by regional word is stability, you know, first political stability, because I will just like mention briefly, before the Russian aggression on Ukraine, Bosnia was slipping like almost into a new conflict. Like we really had the high level of like political crisis where entity of Republika Srpska was trying to proclaim independence. It's extremely important to mention like regional context also, that, you know, the part of our country is supporting on some way the aggression on Ukraine of like, you know, being like or politically neutral, or like not trying to engage, or, you know, openly showing the support. Last year, sometimes in April, the president of Republika Srpska gave a Medal of Honor to Vladimir Putin during the, you know, like, so it's really reflecting a lot on, you know, our country and the region. But I'm trying to stay positive and not to go too much in the current problems and issues we have with, you know, like 56 schools, for example, 2 schools under one roof, which is a pure phenomenon of segregation, where young people, kids, are physically separated in the same building. You know, they go in the same building, but they are separated through curriculums. They don't even interact during the school breaks. With a high level of corruption, you know, country with 186 ministries, without state ministry of education, for education, a massive brain drain, and young people who just want to leave the country. So I'm trying to kind of pull up some good lessons and experiences, because we do need a hope. On another hand, I mean, at least in this moment, we do have a lot of reasons to be optimistic. We got this pre-candidate status for the European Union. There is a lot of also support coming from the countries who do have a rich experience in the process of dealing with the past. In this case, Germany. Our current high representative is it's a German. There is a lot of good new developments, for example, regarding the genocide denial, which is a huge problem in our country. The first register of war criminals will be established. So there are some good things also happening. So that is why I want to conclude kind of that there is a hope. We can learn, but we do need to utilize, and we do need to listen to local actors and do this process from the bottom to the top, and then like vice versa.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you. We have already talked longer than we were supposed to in this part, but very rich, and we could continue on each of these streams for a longer time. But we want to give our audience a bit of time to bring in their questions. And for that, I'm going to hand over to Kirsten Hartmann.
Thank you very much. And also thank you from my part for the already very interesting discussion. And I'm pretty sure you could all go on for hours. But now it's time for our audience. And if you haven't done already, please feel free to use the Q&A function to pose even more questions. And if you want to direct the question to specific panelists, make sure to also indicate that in your question as well. And before starting with the first question, as our time is limited, as you all know, I would kindly ask all 4 panelists to keep your answers brief so that we can cover as many questions as possible. And without further ado, I would like to start with you, Happymon, because you already talked about multilateral institutions such as the UN, and you also talked about the importance you pose on local peace building. So our audience is, however, interested in what role do you assign to the UN in strengthening global peace, and which mechanisms exist and which need to be developed maybe in addition?
You know, there was a question on the United Nations and also a question on civil society, I think, in general. I'm going to sort of combine the two in my answer. I have no doubt in my mind that an institution like the United Nations and the UN Security Council and its associated arms are absolutely important in a conflict-ridden world such as ours. I think some of, sitting in India, some of our concerns are about you know, humanity, in the name of humanitarian intervention, various states or coalitions have carried out such interventions. I think that's where the questions come from, especially from the global south and countries like India. Anything that is, I mean, India is a major troop contributor, for example, to the United Nations peace operations around the world. So we believe that, you know, it is important to uphold the legitimacy of the United Nations going forward and its systems to implement peace across the world. Having said that, you know, on the question of global civil society and peace building, I am going to sort of somewhat repeat my earlier argument that, you know, institutions and individuals sitting in far-off places, being able to build peace in far-off places, I think that is going to be very limited going forward for a variety of reasons. I think to begin with, peace building is sometimes a very risky business for local actors who are involved in it. And sometimes, you know, institutions located abroad may not necessarily understand that. It's a political process. It is a risky process. Sometimes you get caught in the cross fires of the local political challenges when you get, you know, involved in that process, which is directed from elsewhere. And therefore, I think this is also something that Velma pointed out. It is important to have it is important to avoid black and white approaches to peace building, that this is an absolutist approach to peace building. This is right and that is wrong. I think that doesn't sort of gel well with local conditions. The second part of my argument about civil society is that in global civil society is that sustainable peace requires a lot more finesse, nuance, and long-term investment. You can't have a peace building with, say, 6 months of you know, visit to a conflict situation or a theater of conflict. It needs a lot more investment. My final point about global civil society is that sometimes there is a question that is often asked: whose civil society are we talking about? For example, in many of the you know, international forums where, say, arms control or disarmament or peace building is discussed, you have civil society organizations from the West or from the United States, often supported by their respective governments. You may not necessarily have civil society organizations from the global south, from Africa or from Asia or South America. And to call them global civil society sometimes is misleading, because that's not global enough. That is not representative enough. I know this is the confusing answer, but the objective is to sort of, I think, positively complicate the argument about peace building, as it were. But back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'd like to continue with you, Lidet, because there's a question on the Sahel and on the role or the success of Russia so far in the Sahel zone, and whether you could do the easy part in just a few minutes of evaluating the MINUSMA UN mission in Mali, and how you consider the format of such security approaches in the region, and what would be what do you think is the role of development aid policies in the region?
Yeah, I think on Russia, and if it's successful in the Sahel region, I think Russia has been successful in terms of convincing the population that an alternative to a European approach is possible. So that's also part of the reason why it's welcomed, and it's welcomed not only by the putschists, for example, but also by the population which wants to give, I guess, another actor a chance. So this narrative, in terms of selling this narrative, it has been successful. But I would say in terms of reinforcing stability, that's to be seen. And my analysis would be that at best, what we could expect from Russia's security engagement in the region is state or regime stability. So I don't think we would see a Russia that is able to not only support the stability of the states, but also would go ahead to support the human security and human safety of citizens in the region. I think that is highly questionable. And that's also, I think, an area then I think where other actors, including development partners in Europe, can play a role. Because as I mentioned earlier, the issue in the Sahel, I know from in Europe, it's very much seen as a security threat and as a security situation, but there's no way of addressing the Sahel security threat to Europe without addressing the underlying causes of it, which are very, very much economic and very, very much about governance, local governance. So that's something to note. In terms of MINUSMA, I was talking to someone yesterday who told me the one and only success of MINUSMA actually is not in bringing about stability, but creating jobs, because they were doing quick impact projects in the areas where they were deployed. And I would also be very skeptical about the idea of replicating MINUSMA to other countries in the region, because again, what we've learned thus far in the Sahel is the highly securitized approaches that we've tried thus far have not brought in the peace, have also not brought in the economic progress a lot of citizens were hoping for. So this is, I think, actually a time to try and do more of the economic, more of the social cohesion sort of work, and less of the security work. And here we also have to recognize the fact that even the regimes and the people have become very skeptical of European security approaches in the region. So I think that's a fact to reckon with.
Thank you very much. And I would like to pose, as we are already running out of time, I would like to pose one last question to all of you. And I would ask this time for a one-sentence answer, if it's possible, because we have a question on if you would have to name one peace-building entity or actor that should be phased out and one that people need to take more notice of, which would they be? So maybe we could start with you, Viviana, and then keep it going one round.
I think that's a difficult question. I will answer the second part, like regarding the kind of initiatives I would like to draw attention to. I think when we think of peace building, of course, all these like macro structures and efforts from the bottom up for the top down, are important. But I would like to highlight of these initiatives from women, from job-oriented programs at the local level, and how they are also bringing change and also attending all these problems of security, of welfare of people, and also trying to prevent violence and disrupt impunity. So I think I would like to highlight them without singling out one initiative, but I would like to highlight the role of these initiatives.
Thank you. Velma?
Similar. I mean, I had the same thought to mention. We do know in Bosnia, the braveness of Bosnian women, especially in the field of preventing sexual violence in conflict. I mentioned how we had this huge number, but also the Bosnian rural women, they also brought like a justice by, deciding that they will stand up at the International Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia. One case specifically from Foča, from Eastern Bosnia, changed the international law, and they became a crime against humanity. And that is contribution of Bosnian women. I'm not even going to mention a lot about the role of mothers of Srebrenica, these incredibly brave women who were fighting for justice and preventing impunity all these 2 years. So yeah, I agree. The women initiatives, and I mean, in our case, also youth of Bosnia, they do give us a lot of hope. They're trying to build a better future. So yeah, that is my thought.
Thank you. Happymon, do you have an idea for one peace building institution that should be phased out?
No, I don't have an idea. I don't have an opinion about what should be retired. I would say that in terms of what must be strengthened, you know, I would say that conflict is not just about active violent conflicts, but also about you know, other kinds of conflicts such as food insecurity, issue of migration, climate justice, energy insecurity, etc. So if I were to sort of say that one institution that must be strengthened, I would say perhaps the United Nations Development Agencies, UNDP in particular, must be more empowered. They should have more you know, resources, because conflict is not just about violent active conflicts. It's more than that. So I think in our part of the world, at least, when we think of conflict, we are not talking about people fighting each other and killing each other. It's about you know, people dying slowly. And I think those development organizations should have more resources to deal with these kind of issues. Thank you.
Thank you. So Lidet, one last sentence from you.
Also on the institutions?
Yes,
yeah.
Because
Yeah, no, I would say there are so many national level, at the local level, there are so many organizations that are doing a lot of the work and not getting the recognition for it. So, I mean, I can't really think of one global institution, but there are so many and so many countries that are doing good work. So I think it's about identifying those.
Thank you. So I apologize for everything that we haven't covered, but I do want to thank all of you, our 4 great panelists, and thank you also for the interesting questions from our audience. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Julia.
Thank you, Kirsten. Also, thanks from my part to our panel for their insights and to the audience for questions. If you in the audience would like to read the full report with all of the findings and recommendations, it is now available at the link that you can find in the chat box. And I now have the honor and task to close this panel, like end things, by tying your answers together in the remaining 2 minutes that we have. And I think there are 3 main points that I take out of your discussion. And I think one is a challenge, one is a solution, and one is perhaps a positive outlook for the future. When we come to the challenge, many of you talked about double standards that mean, as Viviana put it, the credibility of the entire peacebuilding system is at stake, right? Double standards are not a new phenomenon. Questions of legitimacy and credibility of peacebuilding are not a new phenomenon, but in the future, the global frustrations about this from the past 2 years will be a new reference point for old doubts about the legitimacy and the credibility of peacebuilding. And as Lidet has pointed out, this is already happening, looking, for instance, at the credibility of the EU as a peacebuilder in Africa that has been undermined due to double standards. But of course, also Lidet mentioned it because the EU sees its own foreign policy role differently, moving from, you know, a conceptualization of a civilian actor to a more geopolitical power. Speaking of solutions, what should the future of peacebuilding look like? You mentioned a couple of ideas. I think everyone on this panel agreed that the era of large-scale UN peacekeeping missions is over, or Happymon, you used a term that I didn't know before, but I love, the age of helicopter peacebuilding is over, and in future, peacebuilding initiatives cannot come only from the top, be more humble, use more humble language, could work more with regional powers, definitely invest more in local responsibility and leadership. I think you all mentioned that. Invest in prevention and invest more in fulfilling economic needs in order to address the root causes of conflict. And finally, when it comes to a positive outlook, I think we've talked a lot about negative trends today, and we see a lot of negative trends in the world. But as both Viviana and Velma pointed out, there are also so many great grassroots initiatives, forces from below, women-led initiatives, human rights defenders that are active to address this and that are trying to bring change, and they need all the support that they can get. So I think all that's left for me to say on behalf of all of us on this panel, thank you to our audience so much for logging on and for asking so many interesting questions. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your morning, your afternoon, or your evening. Goodbye.